But step outside these gilded gates, and the silence is shattered by the screech of a new, unrecognizable era. Across the Bosporus, the frantic clicking of telegraph wires in the European embassies tells a different story. In the smoke-filled salons of London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, the diplomats have already performed their grim diagnosis. They call him the sick man of Europe. They speak of the Sultan not as a sovereign, but as a patient on a terminal deathbed, watching the clock with predatory patience. The empire that once hammered at the gates of Vienna, that made the Mediterranean a private Ottoman lake, is now a sprawling, fragile mosaic held together by nothing but habit, ancient prestige, and massive foreign debts. How did the most feared power in history become a map to be carved up by its neighbors? This is the story of the Great Fracture, the agonizing decay of an old world, and the violent, blood-soaked birth of the modern one. To understand why the empire stopped moving, one must look at its former heart, the Janissaries. Once the most elite slave soldiers in existence, the new soldiers who had taken Constantinople, they had become a state within a state. By the 1800s, they were no longer fighting wars on the frontiers. They were running protection rackets in the streets of Istanbul. They held the sultans hostage. Whenever a sultan suggested importing European cannons or training soldiers in modern tactics, the Janissaries would overturn their giant copper soup cauldrons, the traditional signal for a palace revolt, and drag the sultan to his death. In 1826, Sultan Muhammad II realized the fracture was already fatal. He spent years secretly building a loyal artillery unit trained by European advisors in the shadows. When the Janissaries revolted one last time, Muhammad didn't negotiate. He unleashed the cannons on their barracks in the center of the city. The wooden buildings became a furnace. Thousands died in what history calls the auspicious incident. Muhammad had won his throne, but he had executed his entire army. He was a king with no swords. This vacuum allowed the Great Game to begin. While Europe was undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steel mills, laying thousands of miles of railroad, and perfecting the art of mass production, the Ottoman economy remained locked in a feudal dream. The legendary wealth of the Silk Road was being bypassed by British steamships and French colonial trade routes. Stagnation wasn't just a policy. It was a symptom of an empire that believed its own myths of eternal superiority. By the time the sultans realized the world had changed, the foreign vultures were already circling. The world changed in 1869 with the opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt. It was supposed to be a triumph for the sultan, a new artery of trade that would bring the world to his feet. Instead, it became a bypass. Trade that once flowed through Ottoman heartlands now sailed straight through Egypt, controlled by British and French interests. Egypt, though technically an Ottoman province, began to drift away, becoming a de facto British colony. Then came the second major fracture, the debt. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Ottomans fought alongside the British and French against the Russian Empire. It was a victory, but it was a Pyrrhic one that came with a hidden price. To fund the war and the subsequent modernization of the army, the Sultan took out his first massive foreign loans. This was the Great Trap. Flush with European cash, the Sultans began a frantic, superficial transformation known as the Tanzimat. They built grand, cavernous palaces like dolmabahs, filled with baccarat crystal, massive chandeliers, and Italian marble, trying to project a power they no longer truly possessed. But the money was borrowed. By 1875, the interest on the debt was so high that the empire was effectively bankrupt. European powers didn't send soldiers to collect. They sent accountants. They created the Decree of Muharrem, giving foreign bankers direct control over Ottoman tax revenues, from salt and silk to tobacco and spirits. The Sultan was still on his throne, but the keys to his treasury were in London and Paris. The Sublime Porte had become a puppet theatre. The people in the streets realized their shadow of God was a man in debt. The sacred bond between the Sultan and his subjects was the first thing to break. Inside the mind of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the world was a nightmare of conspiracy. Rising to power in 1876, he was a man of deep, claustrophobic paranoia. He retreated into the Yildiz Palace, a fortress surrounded by thousands of spy reports and a private zoo. He rarely left the palace grounds, terrified of assassination or a coup. Abdul Hamid saw the fracture everywhere. He saw every new school, every new newspaper, and every Western-educated officer as a potential traitor. He tried to halt the decay by leaning into a new identity, Pan-Islamism. He emphasized his role as the caliph to rally the global Muslim population, hoping that religious loyalty could replace the failing civic loyalty of his diverse subjects. He built the Hejaz Railway, a massive iron vein through the desert to the holy cities, meant to unify his Arab provinces and allow him to move troops faster than a rebellion could spread. But the railway couldn't stop the rot in the Balkans. One by one, Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia tore themselves away, backed by Russian bayonets and British diplomacy. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were the final proof that the empire was dying. In a matter of weeks, 4 small Balkan nations destroyed the Ottoman forces in Europe. The carnage was visceral. The empire lost 80% of its European territory in a single season. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees flooded into Istanbul, bringing stories of horror and displacement. In the military academies, the Young Turks watched. In 1908, they launched a revolution to save the state through modern secularism. They broke the absolute power of the throne, but in their quest to save the state, they left it leaderless and ideologically divided at its most dangerous hour. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire became the board for the Great Game. This was a Cold War fought with maps and whispers. On one side stood the Russian bear, desperate for a warm water port in the Mediterranean, the Tsar's dream of reclaiming Constantinople for Orthodox Christianity. On the other stood the British lion, terrified that a Russian presence in the Bosporus would cut the lifeline to India. The sultans survived for decades by playing these two giants against each other. They would promise the Russians territory in the east to keep the British supportive in the west. But this balancing act meant the empire never truly modernized its own defenses. It relied on the mercy of rivals. Because the Ottomans were never strong enough to be an ally, they became a buffer zone. But then the geopolitical plates shifted. Britain and Russia, longtime enemies, signed an entente. Suddenly, the Sultan was no longer useful as a buffer. He was an obstacle. Therefore, when the Young Turks took power in 1908, they inherited a state that was no longer protected by European competition. They were alone in a world of wolves. To survive, they looked to a new, rising power, the German Empire. It was a partnership of desperation, a marriage of the falling moon and the rising eagle, and it would lead them directly into the fires of 1914. The final collapse was a sudden, violent incineration. The decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany was the ultimate, fatal gamble of the Young Turk leadership, specifically the 3 Pashas. They dreamed of a Turkic empire stretching back into Central Asia. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. In the frozen, jagged mountains of Sarikamish, Enver Pasha led 90,000 men into a Russian trap in midwinter. It wasn't just the enemy that killed them. It was the empire's own incompetence. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death in summer uniforms because the supply lines had failed. This was the moment the military fracture became irreversible. As the borders collapsed, the internal fracture became a canyon. Paranoia led the state to turn on its own citizens, leading to the horrific targeting of the Armenian population in a desperate, failed search for internal enemies. In the south, the Great Fracture became literal as the Arab Revolt, fueled by British gold and the promises of T.E. Lawrence, tore the Holy Lands away from the Sultan's grip. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was a skeleton. British warships occupied Istanbul, their heavy guns trained directly on the Sultan's bedroom windows. But there was one final moment of defiance. Gallipoli. In 1915, the British and French attempted to seize the Dardanelles and knock the empire out of the war. They expected the sick man to crumble at the first sight of a dreadnought. Instead, they met a wall of Ottoman steel led by a young, unknown colonel named Mustafa Kemal. For months, the cliffs of Gallipoli were a meat grinder. The Ottomans fought with the desperation of men protecting their last home. They held the line. They won the battle, but the war was already lost. By 1918, the empire was a skeleton. British warships occupied Istanbul, their heavy guns trained on the Sultan's windows. The last Sultan, Mehmed Vi, signed the Treaty of Sèvres, which effectively erased 600 years of history. The empire was to be divided, and the Turks were to be left with a tiny patch of land in central Anatolia. From the ruins, a strong man emerged. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk looked at the dying empire and felt no nostalgia. To him, the Sultanate was a corpse that needed burial. He led a war of independence against the Allied occupiers and the Sultan himself. He understood the Great Fracture better than anyone. You could not build a modern republic on the foundations of a medieval caliphate. He abolished the Sultanate and, finally, the Caliphate itself. In one stroke, the spiritual center of the Islamic world was gone. He banned the fez, changed the alphabet from Arabic to Latin, and closed the ancient religious courts. Ataturk dragged a new Turkish Republic into the sunlight, trading the sprawling, chaotic liberty of a multi-ethnic empire for the rigid, disciplined order of a nation-state. Today, we live in the scars of that fracture. The Sykes picket lines drawn by Britain and France filled the vacuum left by the sultans. They were lines drawn on a map by men who had never seen the desert, ignoring tribes, faiths, and ancient trade routes. They created artificial nations that have been at war with themselves ever since. The fall of the Ottomans is a reminder of how thin the line is between order and chaos. It shows us that an empire can survive for centuries on prestige and prayer, but it cannot survive the loss of its internal logic. When a society tries to bridge the gap between a gilded, ancient past and a brutal, industrial future, it often finds that the bridge is too weak to carry the weight. The fracture doesn't just break the government, it breaks the world. And in the silence of the abandoned palaces of Istanbul, the incense has long since faded, leaving only the cold wind off the Bosporus to tell the tale of an empire that forgot how to change, until the only change left was death.